Well, welcome here. I'm glad you all set aside some time to come and join us tonight for this event. My name is Conrad Stace. I'm the archivist at the Mennonite Heritage Archives, and together with Selena Wolf and a team of volunteers, we manage the archives. The archives is a community memory institution where we collect, preserve, make accessible, and help interpret the Mennonite experience. Archives, and this evening is supported by Mennonite Church Canada, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, and Canadian Mennonite University. Tonight we're pleased to host Mennonites and Hutterites at a Crossroad, 1914 to 1926. We'll have two speakers tonight. Dr. John Friesen will explore the Mennonite experience in Canada and the departure of Mennonites for Latin America and South America. Ian Kleinsasser will examine the Hutterite experience in the United States and their early settlement in Canada. Then we'll have some time for some questions and answers from the audience. Selena will close the formal part of the evening, and then you'll be invited to join us in the gallery and archives for refreshments, but also seeing the exhibit, Voices of a Conscience, which fits into this whole topic. So our first speaker is Dr. John Friesen, Professor Emeritus at Canadian Mennonite University, and he'll be followed by Ian Kleinsasser from Crystal Springs Hutterite community near St. Agath. John, please.
Good evening. It's good to see you here, and I hope we'll have an interesting time together. I was asked to speak about the impact of World War I on Mennonites in Canada, with special emphasis or special focus on Manitoba. First of all, some introduction and context. Wars are destructive and usually fought for flimsy reasons, but they do cause changes. So it was with World War I. So it was with World War I, which lasted from August 4, 1914 to November 11, August 4, 1914 to November 11, 1918. This war changed the face of Europe. More than 10 million lives were lost. The war caused the collapse of four great empires: the Russian, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman. Ironically, the war also planted the seeds for the demise of the empires of the victors, the British and the French. This evening, I will look at how this destructive war affected Mennonites in Canada, with special emphasis on Manitoba, as already indicated. The primary studies I used for this project are Adolf Ence's Subjects or Citizens, the Mennonite Experience in Canada, 1870 to 1925, Frank H. Epp, Mennonites in Canada, Volume 1, The History of a Separate People, as well as his Mennonite Exodus. And I also used Glenn Penner's compilation of names of Mennonites who served in the military in World War I. We usually think of nobody served, but there were some, and almost 200 Mennonites. On August 4, 1914, when Britain declared war on Germany, Canada, as part of the British Empire, was automatically at war. Canadian young men volunteered by the thousands. By the end of the war, Canada had more than 600,000 men in uniform. As the leaders said, they fought and died in the muddy trenches in France to save the world for democracy. Within Canada, support for the war was greatest in the prairie provinces, right here where many Mennonites lived. At first, Canada fought the war with volunteers, but when more men were needed, Canada in 1917 enforced the controversial program of conscription. However, conscription netted comparatively few soldiers, less than 25,000. As already indicated, except for about 200 volunteers, most Canadian Mennonite men did not go into military service. Mennonites were one of the historic peace churches and thus, according to Canadian law, exempted from military service. So why were Mennonites exempted? Mennonite exemption from military service goes back to the immigration of Swiss Mennonites from Pennsylvania to Upper Canada, now Ontario, in the years following the American Revolution. The Revolution ended in 1783. When Mennonites immigrated, they, together with the Tunkers, that's Church of the Brethren, and Quakers, petitioned the government for exemption from military service on the basis that their denomination's confession of faith forbade military service. Since in Britain, the government had already recognized as non-criminal certain forms of religious dissent, like rejection of military service and not swearing the oath, the government of Upper Canada in 1793 granted these three historic peace churches the right not to bear arms. The peace churches, however, had to pay a fine for every soldier exempted. In 1849, after many petitions, these fines were removed. In various acts by the legislature of Upper Canada, the exemption from military service was reaffirmed and upheld right up to Confederation in 1867 and beyond. In 1873, when Mennonite delegates from Russia asked the Canadian government if their men would be exempted from military service if they should settle in Canada, the government granted this privilege since the precedent had already been established with Swiss Mennonites. In Clause 1 of an 1873 Order in Council, the government stated, and quote, an entire exemption from military service is by law and order in council granted to the denomination of Christians called Mennonites, end of quote. However, in the Canadian government's 1906 revision of the Military Act, the revision stated, such persons are exempted who from doctrines of their religion are averse to bearing arms or rendering personal military service under such conditions as prescribed, end of quote. Mennonites wondered if this was a revision or a reaffirmation of the 1873 Order in Council exemption. When World War I started, Mennonites in Manitoba were thus not sure whether they would be exempted. Also, would Mennonites in Ontario and in Western Canada, Ontario, Manitoba and Saskatchewan specifically, would they be treated equally? Numerous Mennonite delegations from both Ontario and Western Canada came to Ottawa to clarify the situation. Government officials were often confused by the number of Mennonite church groups and their delegations. Nevertheless, despite this confusion and some anti-exemption and anti-Mennonite sentiment in the public, the government continued to honor its commitment for exemption. In gratitude, various Mennonite groups made repeated voluntary financial contributions to the Canadian Patriotic Fund, a fund designed to assist dependents of military men. In January 1917, when the Canadian government required all men between the ages of 18 and 65 to fill out national service cards, Mennonite leaders in Manitoba were at first alarmed. Was this a precursor to military conscription? When the government clarified that this inventory was only meant to establish manpower available for agricultural work, most Mennonites filled out the cards, but were instructed to write Mennonite across the cards. And that completely contradicted with what they'd said earlier. In the fall of the same year, August 1917, Canada passed the Military Service Act, which provided enabling legislation for conscription. This legislation was bitterly opposed in Quebec and created anxiety among Mennonites in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. It was not clear if all Mennonite immigrants after the 1870s were exempted from military service. It also was not clear if unbaptized sons of Mennonite families would be exempted. In the end, Mennonites of various migrations were all exempted, as well as unbaptized sons of Mennonite families. This was true in the larger Mennonite communities in Western Canada, although some families living in scattered communities had difficulty getting exemptions. In June 1918, the government required a second registration of all men of military age. Many Mennonites complied. The Rhinelander Mennonite bishops at first did not. The Rhinelander Church was later called the Old Colony Mennonite Church. When P.C. Locke, the superintendent of registration, explained to the bishops from Manitoba and Saskatchewan, who were meeting in the village of Rhineland, south of Winkler, that this registration was similar to the registration of Joseph and Mary in Bethlehem as recorded in Luke chapter 2, the Rhinelander bishops decided to allow their men to register. It's fortunate that he knew his Bible. The Canadian government made a distinction between Mennonites in Ontario and Mennonites in the West. Mennonites in Ontario were exempted from combatant service, but were still required to be part of the military and go through basic training. Mennonites in the West were accepted. The government decided that the word accepted meant a larger exemption, and so they were accepted from military service altogether. As the war developed, and one could tell stories about Swiss Mennonites and Brethren in Christ, people who had a great deal of difficulty getting exemption from military service. As the war developed, the Canadian government became increasingly concerned about Canadians of German descent. It saw them as security risks. The War Measures Act of 1914 had given the government broad authority to suspend civil liberties. And so starting in 1917, the German language periodicals were censored and banned. The censorship was at first directed at foreign-based periodicals and then extended to those that were published in Canada. Die Mennonitische Rundschau, der Bundesbote, der Mitarbeiter, and the Steinbach Post, just to name a few, were censored and or banned. After the United States entered the war in early 1917, small groups of Mennonites and Hutterites migrated to Canada seeking exemption from military service. The immigration of these peace groups further stoked anti-peace church sentiment within the Canadian public. Peace groups were seen as, at best, not doing their civic duty, and at worst, as enemy aliens. One immigrant group originating in Harald, Oklahoma, founded the Harald Mennonite Church near Morden, Manitoba. And some of you may either come from there or know about it. The number of Mennonite immigrants was likely no more than 500 to 600 people, much smaller than the 30 to 60,000 which one alarmist member of Parliament claimed. The Hutterite immigration story of this during this time will be presented by Ian later. These developments caused the Canadian government on May 1 and June 9, 1919, to close its borders to all Mennonite, Hutterite, and Doukhobor immigration. Now let's turn to education. Education in Canada is the responsibility of provincial governments. However, in 1914, for Mennonites in the West, education was framed within the clause, and within Clause 10 of that 1873 federal government's Order in Council. Earlier I referred to Clause 1, which dealt with exemption from military service. And Clause 10 deals with education. This Clause 10 stated, "The fullest privilege of exercising their religious principles is by law afforded to the Mennonites without any kind of molestation or restriction whatever, and the same privilege extends to the education of their children in schools." With this clause, the federal government promised something it had no right to promise. This fact did not, however, become a problem initially. Since Manitoba was a bilingual province, according to the Manitoba Act, when Mennonites arrived in 1874, Manitoba schools were registered under two boards, one English and Protestant, the other French and Catholic. Settlers could also organize private schools. So some Mennonites organized schools registered under the English board. The majority, however, were private. This satisfied Mennonite educational needs. It also satisfied the government. In 1890, under pressure from a growing English public, the Manitoba government abolished the French board and set up one English board with schools to be using English only. French was eliminated from the school system. The resulting national furor over the issue of French rights in Manitoba was resolved in 1897 in the Greenway Compromise. It stated that, quote, rural schools in which there are 10 or more students who speak a language other than English are permitted to teach in French or such other language and English upon the bilingual system, end of quote. Private schools also continued to be allowed. Thus, from 1897 to the beginning of World War I, Mennonites had either district bilingual schools or private schools. Again, this arrangement met Mennonite needs. In early 1914, the Manitoba government passed the Compulsory School Attendance Act. Attending a private school fulfilled this requirement. The government was also concerned about English language instruction in the Mennonite private schools. But since the quality and amount of English language instruction in these private schools was gradually improving, the government decided not to interfere. This tolerance, however, collided with strong pro-English sentiments in Manitoba. The stated aim of all Manitoba governments in the early 20th century was to, quote, to assimilate the immigrants from the Central and Eastern European lands to the high ideals of Canadian citizenship, that is, to the noblest conceptions of Anglo-Saxonism, end of quote. Bilingual schools did not fit into this narrative. So even before the war, the bilingual schools were under attack. World War I, which was fought against Germany, increased opposition to the bilingual German-English schools. Despite opposition from Mennonites and the French, the Manitoba government on February 29, 1916, repealed the bilingual part of the 1897 School Act and ordered schools to be English only. This affected the public schools, but not the private schools, which constituted about half of the Mennonite schools at that time. In the following 2 years, many public schools, public district English schools, reverted to private status, or I should say, many of the public schools which had been bilingual now reverted to private status and continue to teach a bilingual curriculum. In response, the Manitoba government authorized John F. Greenway, who was already authorized to enforce school attendance, also to take over all private schools. No, to take over all public schools that decided to revert to private status. So the private schools that now wanted to become, public schools that wanted to become private, he took them all over under legislation by the government. Starting in the summer of 1918, Greenway had the local school boards dismissed. He had himself appointed as the sole trustee for each public school district and operated the school as an English-only public school. Mennonites resisted, and in some districts, attendance was zero. Greenway proceeded to fine or jail parents until they sent their children to the public school. The government next turned its attention to private schools. It simply decreed that education in private schools was inadequate. It didn't really do much checking. And imposed public schools on private school district. A newly built public school often served 2 to 4 villages, or 2 to 4 private school districts. By 1920, all private schools were closed, even those that offered to teach the provincial curriculum and use English only as the language of instruction. Mennonite communities resisted this imposition by not selling building supplies to Greenway to build these Zwangsschulen, these compulsory schools. Supplies had to be brought in from Winnipeg, presumably by train. Some schools had few or no students for months on end, or even for a full year. But eventually, fining and jailing parents forced most to comply. As a result of the anti-Mennonite sentiment during the war, by 1917, Mennonites lost their franchise. That's the right to vote in provincial and federal elections. The reasoning was that if Mennonites were not willing to fight, neither should they be allowed to vote. Some of the most vocal proponents of this were suffragette women like Nellie McClung. They argued that those who contributed to the war should have the right to vote. Women contributed, so they should have the vote. Mennonites did not contribute, so they had no right to vote. Perfect logic. Mennonites' response to these harsh developments varied. Many accommodated to the new reality, especially to the school situation, and accepted the changes. The 3 largest Manitoba Mennonite churches, the Rhinelander Church, that's the old colony, according to later designation, the Sommerfelder and the Kortitzer, they, however, felt that they had been betrayed. Clause 10 in the 1873 Order in Council, which dealt with education, had not been honored. They refused to accommodate and looked for emigration possibilities. They wanted to have control over their children's education because their future lay with their children, they felt. Thus they needed to protect them from the public schools whose stated goal was to assimilate their children to national ideals and priorities. These 3 churches, which constituted about 3/4 of Mennonites in Manitoba at that time, investigated immigration possibilities, first of all in Quebec, and then in the states of Alabama and Mississippi in the US. None of these options, however, were favorable or worked out. However, the Rhinelander Church lost $250,000 in a failed attempt to buy land in Mississippi. The churches then turned their attention to Latin America. During the years 1919 to 1922, the Rhinelander Church sent 8 delegations to Latin America and the Sommerfelder and Kortitzer churches sent another 5. So a total of 13 delegations were sent to Latin America. The result of all these emigration efforts was that in the years 1922 to 1926, the bishops and most of the ministers of the 3 major Manitoba churches emigrated, together with about 5,600 members, 5,600 members. 3,800 went to Mexico, almost 1,800 to Paraguay. This emigration, together with the 2,400 Mennonites from Saskatchewan who emigrated, amounted to the largest mass emigration from Canada ever. In both Paraguay and Mexico, Mennonites received the privileges they were looking for. They were exempt from military service, could have and control their own schools, operate their own institutions like the Waisenamt and fire insurance organizations, and buy large enough tracts of land to establish their village system of landholding. It was mentioned earlier that the Canadian government on May 1 and June 9, 1919, closed the country to immigration by Mennonites, Hutterites, and Doukhobors, 3 peace groups. This law was so stringently applied that even American Mennonite delegates to binational conferences and meetings were barred from entering Canada and were turned back at the border. After vigorous appeal by Mennonites, this restriction was lifted on June 2, 1922, by the newly elected federal Liberal government under William Lyon Mackenzie King. This opened the door for about 20,000 Mennonites from Russia, USSR, to immigrate during the 1920s, with about 6,000 settling in Manitoba. The same year, the same war that caused almost 6,000 Mennonites from Manitoba to emigrate caused about 6,000 Mennonites from Russia, Soviet Union to immigrate into Manitoba. The war thus caused a major transformation of Manitoba Mennonites. Those who emigrated to Latin America started a whole new, very large, and rich chapter of Mennonite transnational experiences in the Americas. The war thus had a profound impact on Mennonites in Manitoba, the results of which are still evident today. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great privilege and an honor to be here, especially to speak with Dr. John Friesen, who has spoken to many groups of Hutterites over the years. I've personally found his teaching and his history lessons very inspiring. So I want to take this time to thank you again, John. So this year, Hutterites celebrate 100 years of permanent settlement in Canada. How do I do? Okay. Through this century, the Hutterite communities in South Dakota and Manitoba faced many challenging crossroads decisions, and each one brought consequences which could not have been foreseen at the time. In 1918, as the Great War in Europe was coming to a close, the Hutterite communities in South Dakota found themselves at a critical crossroads. Should they choose to stay in the United States and face possible further persecution, or should they sell everything and move to Canada? Now, let's talk about the backstories or the impetus for the migration into Canada. So why are the Hutterites here? An unknown Hutterite chronicler gives us the Coles Notes version. It states, the first thing you want to remember is that the immigration from South Dakota to Canada was caused by the war, which took place in the year of 1914. This war was known as the First World War, and it caused the Dear Gemeinde much conflict and sorrow. Many of the old generation have passed on already, but there are still a few who lived through this time and experienced these hardships. Some written accounts describe in part what happened. So in this lecture, we cannot give an exhaustive account of what happened, but we will try to outline some of the significant factors which ultimately contributed to the Hutterites leaving South Dakota and settling in Canada. So the war and the anti-German sentiment. When America entered World War I on April 6, 1917, there were 17 Hutterite communities in South Dakota with an approximate population of about 2,000. For the most part, these German-speaking people lived in prosperous, self-sufficient communities that took care of all the needs of their members. Up until April 6, the Hutterites had been well tolerated by their local state and neighbors. Local newspapers referred to the Hutterites as honest, frugal, industrious, and wonderfully law-abiding. A farmer living next to the Rockport Hutterite community stated, "The Hutterites are a good, honest, reliable people who will do anything to help a friend." In a report, the Mennonites of South Dakota, Hutterites were commonly confused as Mennonites, Gertrude S. Young states, "It would not be possible, I think, to find among a group of foreign contributors to our state greater generosity, finer courtesy, and more real kindness. Even among the Hutterites, narrow, perhaps failing maybe in their duties to the world, there is a gentleness, humility, and the charity of the man of Galilee." And this all changed in 1917 when the Americans entered the war. Writing in 1920, Bertha Clark, who was, I believe, a sociologist who was working in the area where the colonies were living at the time, listed some of the reasons. The Hutterites have been so quiet and unobtrusive that we were not aware of their presence until during the war. And they were brought before the courts, fined, imprisoned, and at last, by these things, forced to begin upon another exile. Overnight, neighbors and public opinion turned against the Hutterites because of their refusal to pay war tax, buy war bonds, or send their boys to fight in the war. They were labeled as yellow foreigners, traitors to God and country. The young men who arrived in the war camps declared their pacifist stances and reported back to their home communities that the stored up hatred, the intolerance, and the mass hysteria broke upon us like a whirlwind. On the 15th of September 1917, 4 Hutterites received notice to report to the Junction City training camp in Kansas. So these were the first 4 Hutterites to receive their notices. This was only the beginning. In total, 55 Hutterites, men, made their way to various camps, war camps located across the United States. In the meantime, Hutterite leaders traveled to Washington, where they petitioned President Wilson and his war secretary, Newton Baker, on behalf of the Hutterite conscientious objectors. While the slow and bureaucratic machinery worked on a solution, the various COs in the camps across the U.S. Faced a variety of abuses. One of the most well-known cases of abuse was that of the Hofer brothers, who were court-martialed and sentenced to life imprisonment in Alcatraz. After suffering weeks of abuse, which included high coughing and solitary confinement, the 4 Hutterites were shipped to Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas, where the 2 brothers, Michael and Joseph Hofer, died. Without a doubt, this event reawakened memories of past martyrdom and was one of the decisive factors which triggered the migration to Canada. The colonies also faced abuse at home. So while the Hutterite conscientious objectors faced violence in the war camps, the communities in South Dakota also faced heavy censorship and mistreatment of their own. On the 19th of February, the Bismarck Evening Tribune reported that a Hutterite mill had been shut down because ground glass was found in their flour. Now, it was there because local neighbor boys had snuck in and put it there. On the 5th of May, the same newspaper reported livestock being taken from the Gemsville community by patriotic citizens and sold in place of war bonds. So I find this image is sort of a fascinating image. You have these 4 men in the foreground who are obviously posing with the livestock they've stolen. But there's an oral history account that says there was a 5th person, a 14-year-old young man by the name of Gus Haig, or Haug. And when the colonies moved back to South Dakota and Gemsville was repurchased by a Schmiedelite group, this Gus Haig, or Haug, was their closest neighbor. And over time became very close friends with the colony. And on numerous occasions, he came to the colony and expressed his deep regret that he had participated in this raid. And he said, I want to repay this. I want to do my part to help repay. And so he offered the community the service of his car. That time the colonies didn't have cars. And so he would, if there was medical emergencies, he would come with his car. He would either let them borrow his car or he would personally drive them into town. And so I thought that's a sort of a great human element story to connect sort of in that conflict, or to this conflict. So then the next part is the next attack against the colonies, and probably one of the bigger ones, was what I call the constitutional attack. One of the most significant attacks brought against the Hutterites in South Dakota was a legal action brought against them by the State Council of Defense. Ever since 1905, the Schmiedelite Hutterites in South Dakota had existed as a unified body incorporated under the name Hutterische Brüdergemeinde Corporation. The listed purpose of this corporation was to engage and carry on the Christian religion, Christian worship, and religious education and teaching according to our religious beliefs, that members should act together as one being and have, hold, possess, and enjoy all things in common. Hoping to destroy the communal system, the State Council of Defense persuaded the State Attorney General to use legal actions to revoke the 1905 Articles of Incorporation. The state argued that the Hutterite Corporation, instead of serving a religious purpose as called for in the charter, instead was only used for economic gain, and that the Hutterites had amassed a fortune without dedicating any of it to the worship of God. Hutterites, they pointed out, did not even have a church building. They were further described as a menace to society, depriving children of the right to attend county fairs and mingling with the outside world, and punishing members who contributed to the war effort. Although the lengthy legal proceedings finally resulted in a technical annulment of the Hutterite Corporation, the Hutterites were allowed to hold their property as an unincorporated organization. The court did not demand receivership or the liquidation of the Hutterite colonies or assets as requested by the State Council of Defense, but the message had been sent. Hutterites were not welcome in South Dakota because of their insistence to hold on to their pacifist views. Das kleine Geschichtsbuch der Hutterische Brüder, an internal chronicle, states that these combined assaults eventually shattered the proverbial overly strained bow of Hutterite forbearance, causing most Hutterite communities to look for new homes and sell their homes at a loss. As a parting shot, the South Dakota State Council for Defense insisted that 5% of the selling price of the land be invested in war bonds and 0.5% be given to the Red Cross. The Hutterites lowered their asking price by the required amount, but left the responsibility for purchasing bonds with the buyers. When precisely the Hutterites first seriously undertook the process of investigating the move to Canada is not clear. We do know that inquiries were already made as early as October of 1917. By late January 1918, 3 Hutterite representatives met with the Commissioner of Immigration, J.B. Walker, and with Manitoba Ministers of Agriculture and Immigration, Valentine Winkler, in Winnipeg to discuss the move to Canada. The group made inquiries about moving to Saskatchewan and Alberta and asked whether the 1873 military service exemption initially granted to the Mennonites and later to the Hutterites was still valid. By May, the Hutterites appeared satisfied as to their exemption status in Canada, but still questioned whether their young men might not yet be subject to the United States draft, to which Superintendent of Immigration W.D. Scott responded that this later point was unclear, but he reassured them that they were not subject to military service in Canada. One factor which played an essential role in laying the groundwork for the Hutterite migration in 1918 was a temporary Hutterite settlement which had been established in Dominion City, Manitoba in 1899. The reason the Hutterites had set up a temporary community there was the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. And so they were afraid that conscription was going to come in, and so they quickly established a colony there. And the colony only lasted a couple of years, and then it was dissolved. But it lay they at that time negotiated with the Canadian government and had all the rights granted to the Mennonites also granted to the Hutterites in writing. And that made the transition in 1918 really smooth. So back in South Dakota, the Schmiedeloit leaders convened a meeting at which they appointed 3 delegates to travel to Canada to search for land. The 3 Hutterite delegates spent the better part of the month traveling out across southern Alberta, examining many properties for sale. Other Hutterite delegates eventually joined them, but both groups came up empty-handed. By May 31, they arrived back in South Dakota. And now I'm talking only about the Hutterites that are located here in Manitoba, the Schmiedeloit. So there were three conferences, the Dariusloit and the Leraloit, who are primarily located in Alberta, in Saskatchewan. The Schmiedeloit are the Hutterites here in Manitoba. So on June 5, 1918, the Schmiedeloit Hutterites appointed 6 more brothers to travel to Canada to purchase land. After a couple of unsuccessful forays in Alberta, the group decided to return to South Dakota. By this time, the other 2 Hutterite groups had already found and purchased land in Alberta. The Schmiedeloit delegates, however, seemed strangely hesitant to choose a location in Alberta. Later oral history accounts and the fact that not all the Schmiedeloit communities left South Dakota would suggest that the Schmiedeloit leaders were having second thoughts about the pending migration. For instance, one oral narrative dating to this time highlights the contingent nature of this decision. So the story is that the delegates were coming back, they were very discouraged to Alberta. And so as they were coming towards Winnipeg, they were all asleep on the train except for the youngest member of the group. And when they came into Winnipeg, the others were okay, let's get on the train, we're heading back home. And he said, well, we just passed through some really nice land just outside of Winnipeg. I wish you guys had seen it. And they're all like, well, why didn't you wake us up? He's like, well, you all look tired, so I'll let you sleep. And so they're like, well, it's not very far, let's go back. So they all jumped on the train and they go back and eventually end up buying it. But years later, one of the older delegates, members, sort of observed or stated, he said, well, I think we would all be better off if he had been sleeping too. So and that's sort of a sentiment you sort of get when you hear some of the older people talk about sort of the experience, the shock of coming into Canada and how different it was from South Dakota. So with the help of a local land agent, the Hutterite delegates returned and looked at the property in the rural municipality of Cartier in the eastern portion of the rural municipality of Portage-la Prairie. Upon visiting several properties, the 6 delegates decided to purchase one of the properties and secure an option on the others. This initial purchase of 18,000 acres was later added to by subsequent purchases. So back in South Dakota, the Hutterische Brüdergemeinde Corporation, in whose name all the South Dakota Schmiedeloid lands were held, began the process of selling off the various community lands. Accordingly, all sales of land in 1918 were made under signatures of the corporate office and corporate seal of the Hutterische Brüdergemeinde Corporation. This created, in effect, one communal pool of monies, which was then used to finance the initial Manitoba land purchase, which totaled $1,183,000 for approximately 24,000 acres. So the Schmiedeloid group all purchased the land together in one big chunk, and then later they subdivided it up into the various communities. And what's really interesting is, for me personally, is that much of this information has been lost from common knowledge among the Hutterites. A lot of it came out of a research project by a local Manitoba historian, Bruce Wiebe, who some of us have been working with over the last few years, and he's been researching this, specifically the land purchases. And he has a paper that's going to be published hopefully later this year on this. So the public response to the sale, actually I think I'm behind here a bit. So this was one of the initial properties that became one of the Hutterite colonies. Oops. So even though the initial public response to the land sale to the Hutterites was positive, it soon gave way to discontentment and downright hostility. A July 11 issue of the Oakville Daily Standard set an upbeat tone when it first broke the news of the Hutterite purchase. These settlers were rumored to be quite wealthy and would possibly stimulate economic growth in the area. But by late July, and particularly in August of 1918, the large influx of Hutterites arriving in Manitoba to help with the building projects and to harvest the standing crops which had been included in the purchase of the farms caused sort of an uproar. The entry of these German-speaking pacifists while the country was still at war in Europe, and their acquisition of land that some thought should be made available to returning soldiers, caused an almost immediate backlash. Much of this opposition came from the Winnipeg Great War Veterans Association, who took it upon themselves to force the Canadian government to enact a Hutterite ban. The situation became quite dangerous as the Veterans Association threatened to take matters into their own hands to stop any further Hutterites from crossing the Canadian border. They went as far as to threaten to picket the border with armed men and physically stop the Hutterites and I guess the Mennonites from coming in. By May 2 of 1919, the hostilities against the Hutterites reached a fevered pitch, and the Canadian government was pressured into passing an order in council which banned Hutterites, Mennonites, and Doukhobors from entering into Canada. For the duration of the ban, those persons not yet in Canada were forced to remain in South Dakota. So what complicated it for the Hutterites were that some of their colonies, half the people had only come up in that time. And so they were also in the process of selling the land. So they had to repurchase some of the land for the people who had to stay behind. So in a letter written on the 29th of September, Reverend Joseph Kleinsasser explained why the Hutterites had not all moved to Canada at the same time. First, because we could not dispose of all our large properties, both real and personal, in so short a time, although it was offered for only about half of its actual value. And secondly, because quite a few of our young men were in camps, and some of them in prison for refusing to assume military service. And nearly all of these young men were married and had families. Furthermore, as these families were of the same fate with us, we could not sell all of our places and leave these without a home. And we could not abandon these women and children and go to a far-off country. Despite this backlash and the passage of the Order in Council, the Hutterites in Manitoba continued with their land purchases. From the documented land transactions, it is clear that the availability of large plots of land was initially due to American speculators, Joseph Hackney and Fred McCartney, and the complicity of men high in the public life of Canada, such as Manitobans Aim Bernard, John Flanders, Portage la Prairie real estate brokers Charles Burley and Joseph Metcalfe, and even Arthur Maine, who served as Prime Minister from 1920 to 1921. So he knowingly sold land to the Hutterites during this time, which Bruce Wiebe sort of speculates that it might have actually affected his re-election. That he may have lost his election because of that, because the Great War Veterans Association found out that he had sold. And he denied it, but Bruce says if you actually follow the paper trail, he still owned the land and he knew about the sale. So these speculators realized huge profits as they quickly bought up land and resold it to the Hutterites at, in some cases, an astounding 210% profit. This profiteering by land speculators was amplified by the fact that the Schmiedeloit had sold their land in South Dakota for less than half their value. This amounted to a severe debt load, which took the Manitoba Hutterites many years to repay. And what further complicates it was that some Hutterites had decided to stay back in South Dakota. They didn't want to immigrate, and they didn't want to decided, okay, they're going to leave the community, and so they demanded a share of the communities that were for sale and put a lien on the land. So the colonies couldn't sell it, and so the colonies had to actually came up here. They didn't have enough money to buy the land up here, and so they ended up actually having to borrow money, a significant amount of money from the Great West Life Insurance Company, which put them in debt for many, many years. In short, the Hutterites took over ownership from the speculators and worked to preserve the land for their children. As a communal society, they eliminated the need for the property to change ownership with each succeeding generation. With forbearance and forgiveness, they countered greed, deception, cronyism, misunderstanding, and animosity. In the post-World War I period, the anti-immigration rhetoric directed against the Hutterites earlier faded. The newspapers which had called for the forced eviction of the Hutterites now referred to them as first-class farmers, of which more was needed. The Order in Council banning Hutterites from Canada was rescinded on June 2, 1922, and that allowed the remaining colonies to come into Manitoba. And one of those groups actually came up and bought the Blumengard Mennonite Dorf at that time, and resettled it. So conclusion. So in conclusion, I would like to end with a brief story of the migration that never happened. A fitting title for this story might be Like the Mennonites, Only Later in Time. So I'm going to go a little bit out of the time frame, but I think it connects the time frame that we set for the year. So historically, Hutterites and Mennonites share a curious connection. What happens in the Mennonite context, be it migration or acculturation, seems to eventually happen in the Hutterite context as well, only later in time. This curious development is no accident. After all, Hutterites and Mennonites share a common theological and geographical history. Both groups were strongly influenced by the Reformation-era persecution, which pushed them from one land to another. When the Mennonites fled, or where the Mennonites fled, the Hutterites soon followed. from Germany to Russia, from Russia to America, from America to Canada. However, in 1922, when many Mennonite communities abandoned Canada for Mexico, the Hutterites decided to stay in Canada. However, by the 1950s, due to increasing restrictive legislation in Canada, the Hutterites were forbidden to buy any further land. The Hutterite communities once again found themselves at a crossroads: stay in Canada or follow the Mennonites to Mexico. Hutterite oral tradition recounts that during this time, a land agent in Alberta, and the accounts about this incident vary quite a bit, convinced some Hutterite leaders that Mexico was a virtual paradise. Oranges and pineapples could be picked without even leaving one's home. So just reach out one window, pineapples, oranges, apples, the picture was really great. So best of all, Mexico was a land of sunshine and warmth. So appealing was the picture painted by the land agents that some Alberta communities began to auction off livestock and machinery, and some even reportedly made a significant cash deposit. At the land agents' urging, okay, click too far here. At the land agents' urging, several groups of delegates visited various locations in Mexico. However, instead of the promised paradise, they found only excessive heat, poverty, and an underdeveloped economy. Greatly disappointed, the Hutterite delegates returned to their homes. There is, however, one alternate explanation why the Mexican migration never took place. By the 1950s, the Hutterite communities owned a significant amount of land and real property. The reality might well have been that the financial cost of moving to another country was simply more than the road-weary Hutterites were willing to accept. Instead, they stood their ground, and in the face of discriminatory legislation and prejudices, they sought political solutions to their problems.